and welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the politics of the COVID pandemic. We're also going to be looking at Louise Haig's comments. We're also going to be looking at the most recent LucidTalk poll, which appeared in the Belfast Telegraph. And to go through these topics, we have the commentator, Sarah Creighton, and we have the Belfast Telegraph's crime and security correspondent, Allison Morse. You're both very welcome to Slugger TV. Good, our second one back face to face. So Allison, I'm going to start off with you, because we're talking about the Belfast Telegraph. We're talking about the poll that appeared, LucidTalk. For anyone who maybe didn't see it, the DUP having a bit of a rebound. They were up a couple of points. Sinn Féin level pegging, the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP falling back a bit, and Alliance having a good showing too. Alison, what did you make of the poll?
I think what happened was the previous poll had been done during that leadership meltdown that went on in the DUP, and clearly that had not played out very well with their voters. I think that they really suffered in terms of their image with women voters and how they treated Arlene Foster. I think that the absolute shambles that was, Edmund Poots's brief foray into DUP leadership and then replaced. So I think that all the poll, the more recent poll is the stabilising of that Jeffrey Donaldson's leadership has just stabilised it. Their voters just aren't quite as nervous, and that's why you see that sort of change. But no matter what, I do think that this election is going to be incredibly interesting, because unionism is almost split into three ways. There's no big one anymore, no big party. At one point, as we know, the Ulster Unionists were the dominant party in unionism. The DUP took over, they were the dominant party in unionism. It's almost like what happened in the South when you think about that. Those two Civil War parties that basically passed it between them, and then all of a sudden the vote split three ways. I think unionism is now split into people who either care about the protocol or who couldn't care less about the protocol, and that is what we're going to see, I think, in this election. The UUP have clearly said that their position is much more conciliatory on the protocol, so we'll see, is that what the majority of unionists think, or the hardline stance being taken by the DUP, is that appealing to more of the sort of unionist loyalist voters. And again, I think that the problem Jim Allister has is, although he polls very well, he is not transfer friendly in any way, which we know is key, and also his candidates. I think he has trouble with candidate selection and trying to raise the profile of those candidates to the point where people know who they're voting for. The party will take them so far, but are people really going to go in and vote for someone who they have never heard of
Just
before?
Before I move on to Sarah, since you mentioned it, what did you make of John Call's comments? Because I know you've covered loyalism now for well over 15 years. So what would you make of his comments on The View last week?
I was right about that in my column this week, because we know who John Kyle. We know he's a man who has the best interests of his community at heart. We know, he is a person, he's a doctor, he's a GP, cares for that community. I think that what we have seen within loyalism, and I have been writing about this for quite some time, is there is a shift from the old guard to those sort of younger. I mean, we call them hawks and doves, call them whatever you want. There is a younger section of loyalism which is pushing those older figures out. And remember, those are men in their late 60s and 70s now. These are old men who were part of that sort of peace process negotiations, the loyalist ceasefire statements, and those are the people that remember that aligned themselves with the Irish government, the British government. Jackie MacDonald was playing golf with Martin McAleese and the K Club. I've been to those sort of British-Irish secretariat dues, and there we have the paramilitary figures of the past standing sipping wine among the great and the good in the middle of it. They were firmly attached themselves to the establishment, and they became the gatekeepers of those communities. And what's happened now is you have a more harder line, more possibly, and more younger generation of loyalists who are saying these people are yesterday's men, and they're trying to push them out. I think that John Kyle is standing, like the little boy with his finger in the dam, trying to hold that back. And at some stage, he's maybe going to have to admit that the PUP is not his natural home. And I imagine Doug Beattie would welcome him with open arms into his party if that's where he wanted to go. I have never in all my years as a journalist seen a political party put out a statement condemning a elected member of their own party's comments. So that was a new one on me.
Okay, Sarah, just back to the poll. What did you make of the findings and what you saw?
It was a really interesting poll. I mean, I think the big headline was that the DUP seemed to be rebounding. And I know there have been different polls, obviously, and there was that poll that was being was a couple of polls actually that were quite catastrophic for the DUP, and then there was the University of Liverpool one that showed them regaining a bit, and then this poll again that shows them starting to raise their profile again, starting to get higher poll numbers. I agree with Alison. I do think it's because they've went through a period of instability, and that is starting to fade away now. I also do think it is the protocol, I think, is coming into it. I also think the prospect of a Sinn Féin First Minister is also coming into it, and I know John Tong had said that it does show that some unionist voters are maybe deciding to switch back to the DUP, just on that basis alone, because they don't want a Sinn Féin First Minister. I wrote about this in the Belfast Telegraph myself, but obviously not every unionist is going to do that. And I think, going back to your point about the split within unionism, I think, yeah, you're right, it's people who care really deeply about the protocol and those that don't. I would say, I think, to be more definitive, I would say it's everybody doesn't like it, but there's those who basically want to tear it down, and those who are like, look, we'll make the best of it. And I think that is where the split is. And I think the Ulster Unionists have probably been a wee bit disappointed by the poll numbers in that it shows them going back a bit. The previous poll had them going up, but I know there was the recent poll as well, which said that Doug Beattie's numbers were quite high in terms of trust. Not as high as others, but I think he will be quite pleased with that. But I think the party still has a lot of work to do. I think to get those unionists, those scundered unionists as I call them, back out to vote for them, and I think a lot of people are still watching them. When
I was reading your article, and I know you were referencing this, how many of those people, do you think those unionist voters, do you think a lot of them could end up going to the Alliance Party? Because obviously Naomi Alliance were polling in around, I was even saying Naomi Long there, but Alliance Party were polling at around 15%, which would be a record for them, and they would gain a truckload of seats off the back of that. So what do you think the dynamics are there? I think some of them are already at Alliance. I think some of them are very comfortable with Alliance, and I think some of them will not go back to political unionism at all. Some of them will, I think, if they get the right party, and there are voters out there that say, look, give me a good unionist, please, I will vote for them. Stick one in front of me, I will go to the ballot box. But some of them are very comfortable with Alliance. It's not a vote for the Sinn Féin or the SDLP. They're quite happy to sit there. And I think the toxicity that exists within political unionism, I think, has moving a lot of people away from them. So, but I do think the Ulster Unionists are still in that period of time where people are watching them. What are they going to do? What are they going to say? I think next year will be the test, particularly with the Sinn Féin First Minister potentially on the horizon. Yeah, and
our unionist voters who voted Alliance just because there was no one else that they could vote for, but they do feel very strongly on the constitutional question, and Alliance clearly aren't. That Doug Beattie, I'm assuming that's who he's trying to attract back to his party. But also remember, those polls only say, who would your first preference vote be? Yeah. And this is all about, it's all about who is the most transfer friendly, especially as in those like really competitive fifth seats. That's key, and that's clearly what he's doing too. He's making his party transfer friendly from people who vote for Alliance, who maybe give him a second preference. He's trying to make it as transfer friendly as possible, and that could be the secret to maybe trying to make some gains. But I mean, it's a tough gig, because a lot of those people, I think they just stopped voting. They just didn't vote at all.
It's just interesting. I mean, we keep talking about this. Is Michelle O'Neill nailed on as First Minister next year? I mean, it's amazing, because I remember, I think when Michelle O'Neill first came into the leadership role that she had, succeeding Martin McGuinness, which was always going to be a tough act. But for the first 18 months, certainly people were talking about, Sinn Féin were not performing well. What do you think? Do you think
they don't actually need to do anything? They just need to sit there and not make a mess. Like, as long as nobody does a major gaffe, do you know what I mean, between now and the election, they're fine, because all the chaos is in the rearview mirror. They just need to let all that take place behind them and just steady the ship and keep it moving. I'm pretty sure if I was in, if you were in a Sinn Féin group chat, it is, do not mess up on social media. Do not say anything they'll ring, because that's all they need to do. They don't need to do anything other than what they are doing, and try and keep that as steady as possible. I mean, I can't see how Sinn Féin won't take the First Minister post. The only reason Michelle O'Neill mightn't be First Minister if there's another leadership challenge and they replace her. But I think that, that decision not to make that a joint office for unionism now is maybe not looking like such a wise thing to have done at the time. They should have maybe took that offer when it was given to them.
And Sarah, just because, you were talking there about leadership trust ratings. Another leader who's rated highly personally is Colm Eastwood. But yet the SDLP are always, every poll after poll, 12, 13%, which is where they were at the 2017 Assembly election. Why are they not seemingly, we keep on talking about their parliamentary party has some high profile people who seem to be getting a bit of traction, but it's not showing up in the polls. Why is that?
I think it's a combination. I wonder just if when voters go to the ballot box of the SDLP, they just suddenly decide that strategically their vote might be better placed elsewhere with Sinn Féin in some cases, or perhaps with Alliance. I just think The party is, I still think, transitioning. I think they're getting a lot of new blood into the game. And, the same way that Alliance, I think, went through that bit of transition and got lots of new blood, and that's completely transformed the party. And I think with getting people in like Matthew O'Toole into the party, which is certainly bringing a lot of voters to them, I think they're still having to go through that. They still have to show that they're different and what they stand for. And I think that's what voters are waiting to see, I think.
Yeah. And Alison, just on that, I mean, obviously we're looking at some of the more kind of minor parties. I know they hit out of the big five. We're talking about the Greens, TUV, People for Profit, and obviously Claire Sugden sitting up there as an independent. Going into the next Assembly election, obviously tis the season and we're getting into that thing. Do you think that they're going to play a role or factor? Should they be worried about? I mean, Jerry Carroll in West Belfast, Claire Bailey in South, Claire Sugden, do they have anything to be worried about, do you think?
Don't think that they have anything to be worried about. I think that they're pretty safe in terms of where they are. It's can they bring anybody else along with them, and that's the issue. At one point, People Before Profit were looking very good that they could have brought people alongside them if they'd used better voter management, in places like West Belfast. But I'm not sure. I think that's maybe steadied out a wee bit now as well. But then you have, for younger people, and I know that you two are clearly much younger than me, but there are people younger than you two as well. and for those people, the priorities are completely changed. I mean, I had to go and speak to a class of young aspiring journalists who were all school age, and they were working on a story, and I would say out of, I remember 15 people, 10 of them were working on stories linked to climate change, which, the big parties just have not caught up with the fact that that is what concerns that age group much more than the things that we spend all our day obsessing about, and I think that the parties all pay lip service, I think, to climate change, but they haven't really established, proper policies in a lot of terms. We have members of certain parties who are really, really, into sort of pushing and campaigning for that, people like Philip McGuigan who cycled, to Glasgow. But in terms of proper policies, I don't think that the parties have caught up with the feeling. And remember, if you're future-proofing your party, they are the voters of tomorrow. They are the future. Those 16 and 17-year-olds, they're coming up to their voting age, and you got to get them when they're young. So I mean, there's a real opportunity there for people like the Greens to come in and try and steal those voters when they're lovely and new and fresh to the system, and get them get them used into a pattern of voting for them. And I think that could see change maybe in the future.
For the talk of sea borders, we will be in the sea. If we don't do anything about climate change, it's ridiculous. They had that big rally the other day. I mean, there was thousands of people there. It was really, really popular, and there was definitely some political parties there. But I agree with you. You often forget, for the younger generation, they really, I suppose, because they're thinking of their future and the disaster that lies ahead of us, and thinking, my God, you're arguing about flags.
Well, that's not Rob, for you and me anyway. Let's not use the term younger people as a different category anyway.
Old geriatric millennials, David, you and me.
Allison's out of that category now, but just on that, I mean, if we can move slightly across the water, and GB News had a bit of a scoop the other week with Louise Hay. Well, it depends on your perspective of a scoop. Louise Hay is the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, for anyone watching this who may not be aware. And she made a comment about that she would not campaign in a border poll. Not that she would support one or support United Ireland. She said that she would not personally campaign in it. Allison, what did you make of that? I mean, there's a lot of debate, people like me scoffing that this has been Labour policy since 1994 and this really isn't new, but Keir Starmer, the party leader, had obviously made a statement that he would campaign to stay in the Union if he was Prime Minister. So what do you...
Interesting, the day after Louise Hay made those comments to GB News, I was on GB News, and then I was in a supermarket in West Belfast, and the guy said, I'm going to tell everyone you were on GB News, and I said, well, I'm going to tell everybody you were watching GB News, and walked on. But yeah, the interview with her, I think, was interesting, because people have said that these are comments that were made, they're quite similar to comments that Tony Blair made in the past, but we know that it's been said of recently, obviously, that if the Union is in peril, and remember, for Westminster, when they're talking about the future of the Union, they mean Scotland, they don't mean us, and they're not going to hold a neutral position on Scottish unity. They're going to campaign, obviously, to try and keep Scotland in the Union, and therefore they would have to, then I suppose, reciprocate that to keep us in the Union as well. But it does make me laugh, because if London was to say, and the Westminster government to say, we do have a selfish economic interest in Northern Ireland, they'd be campaigning flat out for Irish unity, because we're just, like, we cost them a fortune. We're literally a noose around their neck. And look at, we could see what happened with Brexit. Like, literally, we're an afterthought on every single piece of legislation to push through. It's like they make a decision and then they go, what about Northern Ireland? Oh yeah, remember about them, and then try to fix it then again afterwards. It's clearly they don't understand the geography of the place, they don't understand the politics of the place. They're most, loyal citizens, within hardline loyalism, people who are wedded to the union in every sense, feel completely shafted by them. So I mean, in terms of that, you could say that obviously people would expect, whoever the party was in power at the time, to try and campaign to retain the union. But I'd love to see how much enthusiasm they'd actually put into it, because would it be, oh yeah, we really want to keep you in the union with one hand crossed behind their back because they'd really like to cut us loose and be done with us once for all.
So obviously, Sarah, the Conservatives were trying to make play on this. Brandon Lewis was tweeting out comments about that he would never be neutral on the union, the Conservative Party government would never be neutral on the union. What did you make of, one, her comments, and two, the response to it?
They're interesting comments. I mean, I think this can be divided into legal and political. So, there seems to be this view that the Good Friday Agreement legally requires the government to be neutral, or that's what people voted for. No, they didn't. It wasn't a Good Friday Agreement. The Downing Street Declaration is a declaration of neutrality. It was a declaration of basically saying, look, we're not here to, we don't have any selfish strategic interest anymore in this, like what we did previously about 400 years ago, 100 years ago, which was significant, obviously, but it didn't require the government to be neutral. What will happen in any border poll is it will be led by unionists in Northern Ireland. They will make a call about the campaign and the strategic thinking, and the call will be made at that point about what needs to happen from the perspective of London politicians. Obviously, the British government will play a firm role because it will decide on the subvention, everything else, all those things that need to be ironed out before a border poll or after a border poll is called. Whether the government decides to take a firm position or not, we don't know. It didn't in Scotland. The government may say, we're not going to take a position, but the party will campaign, which is what I imagine it might do, or it might not. The Conservative might say, no, we're firmly going for this, or the Labour might take the opposite position. That is a political question. Whether that is a good decision depends on the circumstances at the time. If you ask me if I wanted Boris Johnson running around selling the union right now, I would say no. Absolutely not. Lock him in a cupboard and don't let him out. But equally, if there was no British politicians over here doing something for the union, as I say, it will be a judgment call. It will be very much led from people within Northern Ireland. But, for people to go over and make speeches, maybe go over and talk to people, particularly from the more progressive left flank of British politics, that will be very helpful, I think, to the pro-union case. And I think if there wasn't any intervention, I think that would maybe put us at a bit on the back foot, I would say. So, but it is a judgment call and it's a political call. I do find it frustrating how the Good Friday Agreement is. There's a Good Friday Agreement that was agreed, and then there's like the meme internet version that exists in people's heads that just isn't there. And, to make a serious point, I am concerned that if this keeps happening, that people's trust in this agreement is going to go down. I really do. I do not think it can survive this type of, and this is a very small thing, don't get me wrong, we can't blow it out of proportion, but I will not survive this type of retconning.
The trust in the agreement, especially among loyalists, is clearly gone anyway. I mean, we've seen that with that LCC statement, and then seen it with the Billy Hutchinson thing. And there's people trying to attach the fact that, I don't know whether or not unionism was sort of broadsided by this, but for nationalists, the Good Friday Agreement was a process. It was not an end game. Unionism, I think, at some stage thought that it was a settlement and that was it, and that would move on. But clearly, in the 20 odd years since, things have progressed to the point where you would wonder if that referendum was to happen tomorrow and we had a brand new peace process, what way that vote would go, and would unionists vote in favour of it? Although we have to ban Twitter for the whole referendum campaign.
Everybody got different things out of the Good Friday Agreement, and I've always said unionists never really utilised it effectively, because the ones that agreed it got kicked out of office for the anti-agreement lot, who've never really saw its benefits unless it benefited them politically, whereas Nationalists and Republicans have looked at the agreement and gone, oh look, there's provisions here that can assist us. But unionists have never done that. But it is important to be clear that when the agreement was signed, unionists said the union is safe because it guarantees, it affirms Northern Ireland's position in the union. It says we will not be dragged out without our consent. But those were very important terms. So for these types of talk about, legally speaking, the government has to be neutral, that enrages people. Did you
think that Louise Hay had committed any kind of form of heresy? The way some of the reaction was just.
I think it was. As I say, it's a political call as to whether she thinks they should campaign, and she obviously thinks that she shouldn't. I would hope that she would, but if she doesn't want to do that, that's her decision. But I think it was the implication that it was somehow a legal requirement that I think concerned me. I think, like I say, academics have looked at this, professors have looked at this. We'll probably not know until it gets in front of a judge, I would imagine, but the legal consensus is that is not the case, that we have to be neutral. Yeah. So I think it's important to correct that type of incorrect interpretation of the agreement, but as to whether she's committed like heresy, no, she hasn't. That's just her view. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Just imagine the judicial reviews. Just when you said it'd be for a judge, everything in this place ends up in the judicial review, doesn't it? Everything. Everything. Can you imagine a future border poll? How many judicial reviews?
It's going to be bogged down in litigation.
Even the threshold has had to go before a judge.
There will be every single bit of it. Will be said, no, this is how this is interpreted. This is how this is interpreted. If it doesn't, it'll hold up the whole thing.
Well, since we're talking about legal regulations, this leads us very nicely on to our next topic, which is the politics of COVID-19 regulations. We are now nearly 2 years into this, although progress, we're back here face to face and our vaccines have been rolled out and people are getting the jabs in the arms. Allison, the executive, obviously it struggled to keep one voice even at the start, and that any form of discipline just seems to have totally broken down now between ministers, and any attempt at a united bastion just seems to be gone.
It was bizarre what happened, when that decision on Friday we're going to have vaccine passports, we're going to go with passports for all areas of hospitality, then all of a sudden at 6 o'clock at night or something on a Friday, it was like, oh, it's only for licensed premises, and if you're into like fast food places or McDonald's, whatever, they're free for all. It's like they need COVID passports far more than most bars do. I do think it's a bit of a mess, and I do think that the problem is that as we come closer to an election, we see ministers trying to make popular decisions rather than decisions which are actually good for everyone else. They don't want to be seen to be on the wrong side of public opinion, but nobody quite knows what public opinion is, because the people who, in many cases, and I think this is the same for everything, not just for COVID, the people who are very strongly anti it are usually the larger, louder voices. So we don't actually know how many of them there are, but they know that they're the ones who shout the loudest. There's clearly people within the DUP who, are sceptical of the whole thing. We have Jim Wales, former health minister, who's regularly on the Nolan show, saying how he's not vaccinated. We have Paul Frew coming out and, albeit conducting his interviews by himself on Twitter and not actually speaking to anyone, who's very strongly against it. I think that's unusual. You maybe wouldn't have seen that at the start, where people were very keen because they thought, public opinion was, let's do everything we can to keep people safe. Now I think that people are sort of sliding off all over the place.
But I think it's about the limits that people are willing to go to. I mean, Paul Frew said himself he is not anti-vaccine, he's pro-vaccine, but he says there's a limit to how much you can make people...
Look, listen, I am, from the very beginning, that COVID legislation that was rushed through without any scrutiny, some of it is appalling. It is appalling, and it is a complete and utter infringement in people's human rights. And, if you say that there were, you were being attacked as if you thought Bill Gates was, putting microchips or something in you, when you were just stating the obvious, that this legislation is not healthy. For a government to have that much control over its population is not healthy, especially unscrutinised. There's meant to be a sunset clause in that legislation, and it needs to disappear. And I would always question, when you give a government those type of powers, they very rarely give them back again, willingly. And I, quite happy to challenge that. I don't care what, people come back and say at me because of it. But I'm also, I think we all need to be pro-science and pro-vaccines. When you're vaccinated from, the moment you're born almost, throughout your life. And never once have I ever thought to, question the doctor when I'm sick about what is in. When I actually had this conversation with somebody last week who is, drank the Facebook Kool-Aid and was, but you don't understand, you don't know what's in it, and this is all experimental. Like, my child had meningitis when she was 1, and I handed her to the doctors and went, please cure her. Not once did I say, could you give me a list of ingredients of what that is that you're putting in a drip into my child's arm to save her life? Because what would it have meant to me? And I do think that social media has made this a very different type of argument, but politicians need to realise that is not real. Twitter is not real life. We know that. Facebook is not real life. Like, do whatever is best, following what we were told at the start they were going to do. They were going to listen to the science, they were going to follow it. And I'm against decisions that are made that make no scientific sense whatsoever and are just meant for, conditions of, if we do this, it'll keep COVID in people's minds and they might be more obedient, but it has absolutely no purpose whatsoever. I'm against those kind of decisions. But in terms of showing that I'm vaccinated to go out drinking. Well, I am so keen to go out drinking that I will show anything. Anything you want to say, yes, here you go. Here's my birth certificate, here's my vaccine passport.
Jeepers, getting your birth certificate off, you got
in Sydney oldie English.
Sarah, what do you think of the politics? And again, none of us here are epidemiologists, we're not making any scientific calls here, just the politics of what's going to mean. I appreciate, again, the executive didn't exactly cover itself in glory last year either, but you know, it just seems to have fallen apart.
It just seems like the people go one way and the politicians just kind of follow, or events happen and then eventually somebody gets around to deciding, oh, we actually should do something about this. You know, it's so hard to track and follow what their strategy is. You know, when you say the vaccine passports, we thought they were going to be introduced for everything. Now apparently it's just for the pub. And I thought to myself, well, somebody's obviously got in there and made that. That was the compromise. They were told that they weren't going to get anything and they've compromised and gone for the pubs. It seems completely daft. Then you can go into restaurants and I'm sure you walk past the pubs and the pubs are bunged and there's no social distancing or anything like that as well. But we do have the vaccine and that's a difference. Then we've got the booster jobs and everything else as well. You know, I do think people are at the end of their tether, but they are anxious still about this, and especially with this new variant coming in. I think people are starting to get really worried again, and obviously we have to wait and see what happens. But you're right, you know, this is an infringement on people's liberty and their human rights. It is, and the longer it goes on, you do worry. You know, is the government going to give this back? And you know, when you could see in Westminster, they're passing stuff through really, really quickly. Bills are even going through in the Assembly unscrutinised. It's not healthy for democracy. It's not healthy for the country. But you need to take proportionate measures to deal with the pandemic, you know, and I just, my mum's a nurse, you know, she's the health service is absolutely, it's about to collapse, let's be honest. That's me saying that. So, you know, I just wish we could get a grip on it. I wish we could just get the measures and stick to them and do what we say we're going to do rather than just...
And Allison, this goes back to messaging about, you know, a lot of people just don't know what the regulations are anymore. There's not, it's not that anyone's...
I could not tell you what they are now. They changed that many times, and that legislation I tried at the very start to keep up to date with it, but you should see even the way they just add things on to it. It becomes, you know, a complete and utter, you know, mess of new amendments and changes to it. And we got to the point, you know, where, you know, the cops were saying they didn't understand it. The politicians were claiming that who had written the legislation that they didn't understand it. You know, nobody could. That's why all the fines had to be refunded in Black Lives Matter, because the legislation made no bloody sense. And that's the point, is that the messaging has always been wrong. I think that right now, and the messaging in terms of where we are is, well, first of all, the health service was a shambles long before this started. Do something about it and stop talking about it. You know, do something about the many, you know, people that are bed blocking that need moved on elsewhere. Do something about the care in the community so those people can be moved out of hospital, make space. Do all of that. I think that all of that is essential and should have been done a long time ago. I can't believe we're entering another winter. We're still having the same conversations. You know, pay people properly who work in care homes, you know, value the staff so that they're not leaving and going to work for the private sector or just going and getting other jobs because they can't cope anymore. Like, all of those things would have helped proof things where we are now. And the messaging just needs to be clear and simple. In terms of the vaccine, everybody I know is vaccinated. I mean, I don't know who these people are they keep talking about who aren't vaccinated. But if they're not, could somebody go and ask them what is wrong and then try and use correct messaging? And if that means the government having to message them through TikTok or Instagram or whatever kind of platform they use, well, then that is what they need to be doing right from the very beginning. You know, I don't think that there are obviously crowds of, you know, complete and utter loopers who were into conspiracy theories long before COVID did. And when COVID is over, they will find another new conspiracy theory to get obsessed by. But the majority of people, I think now, who aren't vaccinated, and it's mainly, I know, and they say that from the careers in terms of nursing and care homes, young women who were clearly worried about their fertility because of the message at the start, they need told properly and they need treated like adults and stop treating people like idiots. We need to talk to communities, engage with them. And I think the other thing is just that the other aspect of all this is obviously some people, their lives are irretrievably damaged because of this pandemic. They've lost their livelihoods, they've lost everything. People are living in abject poverty. You know, the furlough's now gone. Yeah. You know, if we're going to introduce restrictions again, we need to talk about support for people as well, because people are not going to comply.
And Allison, Paul Frew said last week about it, you know, I think a journalist asked him about lockdown and he just gave a candid answer and went, there's no money for it. You know, we don't have the money for it, you know, so just
money for lockdown. You can't be putting people out of work at Christmas and with no lockdown or no compensation for it. And you know, Sarah's right, we already had really bad problems for poverty and childhood poverty in this place long before COVID, and it's just exacerbated it. You know, and there are people that some of the people from Stormont would need to get out, get out of that big white building and go and look and see what way people are actually living. Look at their housing conditions. Look at the fact, I mean, poverty and health are completely linked. If you're trying to, you know, help the health service become overwhelmed, then look at the people that are living in houses where damp crawling up the walls, who can't afford to turn their heating on, who, you know, have really poor dads because they can't afford to eat properly. I mean, all of that puts a strain on the health service, but nobody seems too concerned, you know, about that. Instead, they're just accusing people of trying to kill their grannies, you know, and once again, it's that, you know, patronising messaging. You know, if someone hasn't got a vaccine and they're genuinely worried, well then ask them why they're worried and then try and explain the science to them properly and stop, you know, treating people like, you know, members of our own society. These are, you know, our friends and our neighbours, like some sort of pariahs. I mean, I said right from the start, do you remember that snoop on your neighbour helpline the cops had and people were phoning up and going, there's 3 people in my next door neighbour's garden. I think this is so bad for society. Like when this pandemic is over, and one day it will be over, we all still have to live with each other and have to get on with each other. And this, you know, constant finger pointing and blaming people when the problem was always from the top down. You know, never blame things that are happening from the bottom up. They always have to be blamed from the top down. They're the people in charge.
Okay, well look, guys, thank you very much for coming in today and for talking. That's all we have time for. It just leaves me to say thank you for watching, and also a final thank you to our guests, Sarah Creighton and Allison Morris. You can keep up to date with everything else on sluggerotoole.com. In the meantime, thank you for watching.